Oh my goodness, this is awesome. I see people from because our present presenters today, not all can see the chat from where they're sitting, so I'm just going to share with them. We have folks from all over Florida, New York, Utah, all over Texas, even down in the valley, San Antonio, New Hampshire, Tennessee, all over. So we are super excited to have y'all here today. We're going to go ahead and get started in an effort to use as much time. We have a lot to get to today. My name is Lacey Hensley. I'm the director of the Institute for Coordinated Community Response. We are a program of the Conference on Crimes Against Women. And joining me today is my program manager of ICCR, Maya Pridgeon. If Maya will give a little wave, she's helping on the back end of the webinar today and monitoring everything. And if I can get you to advance to the next slide. Thank you. A little bit about ICCR before we get started. ICCR was started in 2018 as a program to work alongside rural communities and helping them to improve their systemic and collaborative response to domestic violence. As of last year, we are a national technical assistance provider for the Office of Violence Against Women. And as you see the language there, all of the findings and opinions today are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Department of Justice. Next slide, please. All right, so along with our monthly free webinars, one of the other things that we have as far as our training is concerned, we have a plethora of on-demand learning. We have several really great roll call training series. Our latest one we launched this summer on sexual assault investigations. We encourage you to check those out at instituteccr.org. We also have a resource library with lots of articles and things to help you as well. And then in the fall, we just started our CACAW Summit, Beyond the Bounds, which is specifically geared towards the needs of rural practitioners. And I saw a couple of our friends from down in South Texas joining us today. So thanks, and be looking for those dates for next year. We'd love to see you in South Padre. Next slide, please. All right, so we are going to get started, and I'm super excited because you heard me talking about where I actually live. So Burleson, which is a wonderful community, very fortunate to have a wonderful police department and fire department in Tarleton right around the corner. So we are joining us today is Chief Billy Cordell with the Burleson Police Department. If you just want to wave, Chief, so folks, and thank you. And then Chief Casey Davis with the Burleson Fire Department. And then we have Dr. Tara Shelley, who is joining us remotely, and then Dr. Kathy Brown. So thank y'all for being here, and I'm going to turn it over to you. One thing to note, guys, is that we are going to be holding questions until the end. So if you'll please use the Q&A portion and put your questions, we promise we'll get to those at the end of today's training, but we do have a lot of content to cover and want to make sure we stay on track. So you guys take it. Thanks.
Okay, so I guess we're going to cover this. So the objectives of the webinar are going to be to identify the nature and dangers of IPV, intimate partner violence related strangulation. We're going to talk about key components of the ordinance and protocol that's designed to respond to strangulation. And we're going to talk about the NIJ funded research evaluation that assessed the effectiveness of the Burleson strangulation ordinance and protocol based on the findings from our study. Now, I'm not running the poll, but we would like I'm assuming the poll is launched. So we wanted to know how you identify. You should be able to see the categories on your screen.
All right, it looks like the results are coming in. Give it just a minute. We have about 50% participation right now. All right, so it looks like about half advocates. We have about 30% law enforcement, about 10% government and officials, and then the rest are either technical assistance providers, a couple fire EMS, and community leaders.
Great. So we do have for some reason, it is not letting me advance. One moment. So we have another audience poll. How would you describe your community?
Okay. This is pretty even.
That's good. Yeah.
With about 70% reporting, we have about 37% rural, 29% semi-urban, and 35% urban.
Okay, great. Okay, so I'm Dr. Brown. I'm going to talk about the nature and dangers of IPV-related strangulation, which we know a lot of you are from the advocacy world. We felt like it was important to discuss the difference between strangulation and choking. Strangulation is actually pressure placed on the neck, anything that reduces the blood flow to the brain or breathing. This includes grabbing, squeezing, crushing of your throat. You'll hear colloquially strangulation referred to as choking, but that really refers to the object inside the airway that inhibits oxygen intake. However, choking is really the term that most strangulation survivors do use. And I know there's a lot of information on this slide. In fact, much of it is something that you may have seen before. We know that about 1 in 4 women experience intimate partner related violence in their lifetime. And at the women at high risk, between 68 to 80% actually do experience non-fatal strangulation by their partner. We know that strangulation is one of the most lethal forms of domestic violence. We're going to have Chief Davis talk about some of those signs and symptoms in more detail. But we know that about 92% of IPV victims who experience strangulation also have a traumatic brain injury. We know that about 58% of people who are strangled, along with being sexually abused, we know that about 9% of those are pregnant. We know that almost in 50% of cases, almost 43% that children witness their mothers being strangled. We also know that most victims believe that they are about to die when they're strangled. Manual strangulation is the most common form of strangulation, and about 38% report losing consciousness. But as far as a lethality predictor, homicide increases the risk for women who are strangled or more likely to be strangled later, about 750% of the time. So we really are trying to look at this training as homicide prevention. There's also colloquial evidence that shows that police officers that are killed in the line of duty are killed by individuals that have strangled women. One thing that you may not realize, I wish I had a soda can here with you, but most people are familiar with flipping the top on a soda can or a pop can if you're in a different part of the country. That takes about 20 pounds per pressure. A normal adult handshake is about 80 to 100 pounds per pressure. It takes so much less pressure than even popping a soda can to strangle someone. 4 pounds of pressure alone can occlude the jugular vein, and it only takes between 5 to 11 pounds to block the carotid arteries, and about 33 pounds of pressure to close off someone's trachea. And we do know that unconsciousness can occur within seconds. One of the problems compounding strangulation is that many survivors show no visible signs of injury, but all should have medical assessment.
Mm-hmm.
When those signs do exist, first responders often miss them or fail to properly document the external evidence, signs, and symptoms about that strangulation. We also know that the majority of survivors do not seek medical treatment, but even when they do, a lot of the signs and symptoms of strangulation are missed by even medical professionals, or they are in fact not documented well. We also know that it's very common for strangulation to be minimized by a variety of parties to this. Strangulation survivors, very often it's so common, they minimize it. Suspects typically minimize it. We know criminal justice professionals minimize it. For instance, someone in dispatch might just say they're breathing heavy or they have a hoarse voice, but they may not recognize that as strangulation. And so there are many reasons why minimization occurs. But again, the common one for victims is that they really, they're probably so used to being strangled that they, and then afterwards that they feel fine, they're really not educated about the signs and symptoms and the potential lethality of strangulation.
Well, depending on where you are, good morning, good afternoon. I'm Chief Cordell and was involved in the early establishment of the ordinance and a lot of the protocols and things. And I'm going to walk you through some of the ordinance and how we came to have an ordinance as opposed to a policy. I'm going to look at the protocols, some of the stakeholders that we had within the group we established to clarify and adopt the ordinance over the policy. But let me start by, I want to thank Lacey and her team, number one, for hosting and having us on to be able to educate about this ordinance. And then I also want to acknowledge the Training Institute for Strangulation Prevention, as well as the IECP, because a lot of the protocols, a lot of the things that we did in our guiding path was from those two entities. As you heard a lot of the statistics from the Training Institute, it's overwhelming. And the data is there that supports everything that we're doing. So with that, I'll go ahead and get started on the next slide here where we're talking about the ordinance. So, the question became, why an ordinance? So some of the first steps in the process was to establish the stakeholders and how we'd move forward with everybody on the same page. We'll talk about the stakeholders here just in a second. I believe the original thought was to address this through policy, but that led to a broader discussion that policy only covers a single entity. I can write policy for the Burleson Police Department, but that doesn't carry over into the fire department or into the district attorney's offices with MedStar Ambulance and others. Furthermore, when you're writing policy, that can change with a leadership change. They can go back in and change the policy, or they can go back in and say, we're not going to continue to do those things. So we wanted to memorialize it through an ordinance because that lives and breathes on well past the leadership changes and things like that. We also felt that the ordinance takes some of the pressure off of the survivor because our first responders get out there when we find out that strangulation is an element of the offense. We can let them know that we're required by city ordinance to contact the medical professionals and then explain to them the lethality of strangulation and the reason we're calling the medical professionals out there to make sure that they're okay. Our goal is to take care of our victims in that. The last bullet point speaks to the ordinance versus state law. Obviously, we started in Burleson with an ordinance, and we have been to legislation and promoted what we believe is a good fit. Now that we have some research that supports that, we're hopeful that we can go statewide with this, and then we can gain some traction from that. So go ahead. When you look at the establishing the ordinance, before we did that, we established our multidisciplinary team, and then we decided to, with the collaboration of everybody, draft the ordinance and take it before our elected officials. So the multidisciplinary team consists of the Burleson PD staff. Beyond myself, I included the sergeant over our criminal investigations, our crime analysts, and our victims assistance coordinators. All of them had a key role in moving forward with the process and the protocols of the ordinance and being able to package that for our district attorney's office and file those cases. Well beyond those things, our victims assistance coordinators contacted our survivors so that they could follow up with them, make sure that they check on them and get them the information for any services or help that they might need and follow up with them that way. Our crime analysts played a key role in being able to package information later on down the line that was used within the research part of this. In addition, our Burleson Fire Department staff and MedStar Ambulance at the time, now Burleson Fire Department operates the only EMS, but we had a third party that operated the ambulance service at that time that was at the table with us. Certainly we included the medical director or a forensic nurse, but we included the medical director in these conversations. We are in 2 different counties in Burleson, so we included Johnson and Tarrant counties, the district attorneys from each, so that the prosecuting side of this would understand the whys behind why we're putting an ordinance together and the importance of being able to look at the data and the statistics. And then we had to make some changes, and I'll talk about those in a little while with regards to the protocols on our packets that we file. And finally, last but not least, One Safe Place, the Family Justice Center of Tarrant County. Our former mayor, Ken Shetter, is the president of One Safe Place, and he contacted me, kind of how this all got started. He contacted me after going to the Training Institute's strangulation training, and we started collaborating on how we could move forward with helping to protect our survivors of strangulation. So that's the team that came in. I would encourage you, if you're considering going down this path, that you have a similar layout of your stakeholders. Get them in at the first of the conversation so that they can have the complete buy-in as you move forward, and that's going to help your path a lot smoother. So look at the city ordinance again. I know the whereas clauses are somewhat small there, but this slide outlines the language of our ordinance that was enacted on February the 19th, 2018. Most of that language came from the resolution passed in the 121st session of our annual conference of the ICCR, and that's titled Increasing Awareness of the Lethality of Intimate Partner Strangulation. So I'm going to highlight some of the main points that resonated with me as I was doing the research after my discussion with Mayor Shetter. Strangulation is, and these are in the whereas clauses, strangulation is an indicator of the escalation of violence and associated with increased risk of serious injury and or death in cases of intimate partner violence. Strangulation has been identified as one of the most lethal forms of domestic violence, as Dr. Brown said, and sexual assault. And oftentimes there are no external evidence of the injury. I think some of the data says that 50% of the cases there's not an external injury that's visible to you. Many first responders lack the specialized training to identify signs and symptoms of strangulation and focus on the visible and obvious injuries. I was trained in the academy a long time ago. Look at the bruise, the abrasion, look at the broken bone, and exactly what you can see. And then you categorize the offense based on what you see there. Well, strangulation puts that in a whole different category because you don't see that injury, but it is very, very lethal. So the lack of training led to the minimization of this type of violence. There was a slide that Dr. Brown spoke on that. And our number one goal is to raise awareness along with our first responders, obviously, to our survivors, to be able to give them information on their medical well-being so that they can have that checked, educate them, and then also to prosecute for impede breathing as opposed to a simple assault type offense. Impede breathing is a felony level in Texas. It is prosecuting a third-degree felony and with a 2 to 10 year prison sentence and up to a $10,000 fine, to give you a little context there. Now, we'll note one change. We've had to amend the ordinance one time, and that was on June the 10th, 2019. The original draft of the ordinance said that we would contact the medical professionals to come to the scene anytime that we find strangulation as an element of the offense. Well, when we started asking the questions, what we were finding was that our survivors were saying, well, I wasn't strangled this time, but I was strangled previously. Well, there was no gray area in the ordinance, so we would immediately call the medical response. So we worked closely with the medical director and our team and changed that ordinance on June the 10th, 2019, that the medical response was required if the act of strangulation occurred within the previous 7 days. Okay. So the implementation of the ordinance and the training and things, the toolkits from Training Institute and IACP, as well as the statistical data, were used to develop our training protocols. We made changes to the family violence packets to improve identification of strangulation. So we had to work closely with our prosecuting attorneys to ensure that they had that information in the packet itself. We established our protocols and policy based on the ordinance and policy that were incorporated into our training. We sent representatives to the Training Institute on strangulation so they could receive firsthand training. And I believe we sent also some of the members of our district attorney's office to go there. From there, we developed our curriculum and began training all members of BPD, BFD, as well as our telecommunicators. And we continue to train new members that are coming into all of these departments to ensure they understand the protocols. I will make one note, bullet point 4 up there, the strangulation flag. We premise locations in our CAD system where strangulation has occurred so that our officers have the information prior to arrival. These offenders represent significant danger. They also represent a significant danger to our first responders. Dr. Brown read a comment in there about the majority of police officers killed in the line of duty are killed by men that have strangled women. So for us, that was a good buy-in to our police officers. And then we're seeing that across the country now, where officers responding to domestic violence situations are being targets of violent acts. So go ahead. All right, so the protocol and the police responsibilities when the act of strangulation is alleged or suspected within the city, a peace officer will summon the emergency medical personnel to the scene. They will utilize a strangulation checklist for consistency that came out of the ICCR's toolkit. We'll document our emergency medical personnel's presence and the role that they had, and thoroughly document the suspect's behavior, actions, and any comments that were made during the act of strangulation. And then we're going to provide the victim with referral information to the appropriate support agency so that, again, we're trying to protect our victims. So we want to give them as much information in their hands for their medical well-being, but also for moving forward from a psychological standpoint. Good. Finally, I'll end with the just some of the things that we're seeing. So Burleson is a town of about 50,000 residents. We don't have a lot of offenses, but when we started highlighting our impede breathing incidents, they generally increased post ordinance on most years. This is a note, doesn't represent all the strangulation incidents. It depends on how they were categorized in the offense report as the research came in, and some listed as different crimes on incident reports. But in essence, we had the ordinance again was enacted on February 19th, 2018, and after the training we implemented on March of 2018. As the slide shows, we went from 19 impede breathing cases in 2017 to 37 in 2018. From 2018 to 23, we averaged 31 cases per year. So impede breathing generally increased post-ordinance in the awareness that we did. So that concludes my comments at this time. I'm going to pass it over to Chief Davis.
Hello. Thank you for the opportunity to be here with you today and present on this. This is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart as we went through this study with Tarleton. So thank you to Tarleton for helping us to become more aware of this in our community. I know as a paramedic and as a firefighter, I was never trained to be aware of these things. We know how to take care of people whenever they're hurt, but like we've been talking about so far, a lot of these people have no signs or symptoms that are obvious. And so I think the biggest takeaway for our department as we've learned through this is just the responder education and being able to pass that education on to the patients that we interact with. So I know it's changed our outlook on this quite a bit as we've moved through. So I'm going to talk about the medical side of this and how fire and EMS start in on this. And as Chief Cordell pointed out, when we started this, it was in partnership with MedStar, who was the transporting EMS agency, and we were the first responding agency, but now we've transitioned to where we manage our own ambulance service as part of the Burleson Fire Department. So it's changed our response a little bit. So I'll talk through all of that as we walk through this. We can go to the next slide. So the ordinance for us, it's pretty simple part for us. It's whenever we get summons to an incident where there was a possible strangulation that happened, and we use a very specific protocol and worksheet to document that patient care assessment. Now, we've also have trained our folks that if they have any suspicion of that, even if a police officer doesn't recognize it, that they're to utilize this protocol and worksheet and let the police officer know of that situation. Now, as you were looking through the numbers that Chief Cordell provided, I think it was an average of 31 each year. Whenever you start to look into our numbers, we're averaging about 50. And I think that that's important if you start to implement this into your community, that your fire EMS should probably have higher numbers than what your police department has, because from the fire EMS perspective, this is anybody that has had any kind of strangulation. It's not just about intimate partner violence for us, because as EMS providers, we're supposed to be unbiased to this. So our objectives are slightly different than what the police objectives are. So, we're not for the prosecution side, we're of patient education. So anybody that could be strangled. So sometimes it could be not a intimate partner violence strangulation. It could be any other type of strangulation or impede breathing situation. So like I said, our numbers will show to be a little bit higher. As we implemented this system into our process, one of the big key takeaways from us was being able to do it digitally. So it's part of our EPCR, or electronic patient care record. And so this is an easy worksheet that is filled out within that patient care record for any patient care response that they could have. It goes through a QC process, as any of our patient care reports do. And so that was very helpful as we were going through the study, that we already had those systems in process as we were going to deliver this. We did do specialized training for our responders, and we were in the situation that we were the first responders, so we had to make sure that we were going on all of these calls, not just the ambulance. So we were committed to going to all of those, and through the training, trying to make sure that we got the staff buy-in. And I think being able to educate our responders on the medical side of this changed their understanding of this quite a bit. So we'll go into the next slide here on kind of what we're looking for from the medical side of things. So some of the symptoms are visible, and some of the symptoms, signs and symptoms, are not visible. And so we knew that utilizing a worksheet, because responders aren't trained on this necessarily, we want to make sure that we got a consistent assessment on this. And so utilizing the worksheet, make sure that we do that. So you could see for yourself here, a lot of the symptoms are obvious. You would be looking for marks, petechiae, any kind of trauma to the face, the neck, those kinds of signs and symptoms. But I think the signs and symptoms that aren't as obvious is, did the patient feel dizzy? Did they go unconscious? Were they incontinent? And I've got a story to tell you about that here in just a moment when we get a little bit deeper into this. However, but like we've said, a lot of the times, oftentimes, even fatal cases, there's no external signs and symptoms. So we want to make sure that we're consistent with this worksheet. And it's a very simple and easy worksheet to fill out. And the staff gets very good at remembering these questions, the more often that they do this and put this together. And there's a spot in the narrative to add on to this as well. So we understand this isn't all encompassing, but it does do a very good job at having a consistent signs and symptoms. So we can advance further here. So I think this is important to kind of walk through when someone is strangled or has their impede breathing that could occur. As quick as 6 to 8 seconds, they could be rendered unconscious. They could have an anoxious seizure or traumatic brain injury within 14 seconds, loss of bladder control or bowel, 15 to 30 seconds. Within 1 minute, you start to get to the point where someone could be deceased from this. So, as little as 62 seconds here. And then within 152 seconds, the study shows that, 100% of people would have died from that or be in cardiac arrest, at least at that point. So I think it's important for responders to know and understand that. And then back to Dr. Brown's point in the very beginning, very little pressure has to be applied to restrict the blood flow to the brain or restrict air in and out of the lung. So, I think whenever you can start to educate your responders and they can understand this on a deeper level, it makes them better advocates for their patients whenever they experience this and they're a part of this. So like Chief Cordell was saying, we had to make a little bit of change to the protocol as we were going through this, because an officer would get on scene, and the way the ordinance was written is if someone said, yes, I've been strangled 6 months ago, then they needed to call us out. And obviously that wasn't productive for the patient or the response and things like that. So it was a great lesson learned for us. We were able to work closely with the medical director in the middle of what we were doing and, come up with a realistic thing. The 7-day policy has worked just fine for us. I know as I've talked to other agencies that have considered bringing a policy like this in or looking at an ordinance, some of the questions that come up is this going to be overwhelming to our system? Is this going to add a lot of calls to our system? And my response to that is always, one, that hasn't been our experience here in Burleson. I think it's definitely scalable to the size organization you are. And then two, I think that us as EMS providers, we have a responsibility to make sure that these patients are receiving some kind of patient assessment. We wouldn't feel that way about any other kind of medical emergency that would come up. So I would encourage you to think through it that way, that we have a responsibility as a community that whenever we know someone's been strangled, that we should at least arrive to the scene and make sure that they're offered an assessment. And of course, like any patient, they can refuse that if they desire, but at least we can have had that conversation with the patient and educate them on that. Go to the next slide here. So of course, like we said, the ordinance is applicable to all strangulation victims. And for us, that's any, not just intimate partner violence. We have about 50 strangulation assessments per year that we do in the fire department. We run about 9,200 calls a year, and 75% of that is EMS out of our call volume. So as you can see, 50 strangulation assessments out of 9,200 calls a year, I don't think is asking too much or being overwhelming. To be able to make sure that you're providing the best care that you can for your community and your citizens and those that could be involved in this. So again, I had the opportunity to speak before a Senate committee here in Texas on this particular topic. And that was one of the concerns from several of the senators there was, is this going to be overwhelming for my small rural community or something like that? And again, the experience that we've had here is that I think it's very scalable to the size organization you are. And that's been our experience. It has not been overwhelming at all for us. So some early mistakes or challenges that we had was sometimes the ambulance would get there before us, and MedStar was not really part. They were part of the understanding of this, but not all of their responders were trained on the response to this. Really, it was our responsibility to show up and do that. And so one of the things we recognized early is that they would get on scene, they would start an assessment, and they would wave us off, but they didn't have the worksheet to fill out. So if you are an organization that first responds that's responsible for this, we had to go back and train our staff. No, you need to continue on and just explain to the crew there why you need to show up and do this assessment and what that's about. Now that we've transitioned to our own ambulance service, that's no longer a situation for us, but it was just something that we learned as we were going through that. I think I've hit on the service demand and staff time and cost. Like I said, it's minimal. I think it's great education for your responders, and they'll learn quite a bit about it. Again, going back to the importance of the worksheet and asking all the questions. One of the stories that I wanted to share is early on when we were learning and going through this is we had a victim that had been strangled. PD was on scene prior to us getting there, and the patient had gone unconscious and been incontinent. And I think the police officers, trying to be sensitive to this person, allowed them to go clean themselves up. And that all kind of happened before our crews got there. And as our crews got there, it looked like it was pretty benign. It didn't look, because a lot of these signs and symptoms are not obvious, right? Mm-hmm. But thankfully, because of the worksheet and they went through the questions and they asked this, they were surprised to learn that the patient had gone unconscious and been incontinent. And so again, I think that goes back to a great example of why the worksheet is so important. And I think it rocked my crew so much that they brought this case and this example up to us of why to utilize that worksheet and to not veer off from it. And so we like to highlight that as a success example of how beneficial the worksheet was and sticking to that, not veering off from that. I think that ends my portion of this.
Thank you, Chief Davis. And I just wanted to jump in and let folks know that are on the webinar that I believe Lacey is sharing out different links to sources that have been identified so far in the webinar and resources. And then at the end of the presentation, there'll also be a slide that summarizes some of these resources. And after the webinar, the slide deck will be made available. I'm not sure on the timing, but Lacey can speak to that a little bit later. But thank you to all of you for making time to be here to talk about this really important issue. I'm Tara Shelley, and I am the director of the Institute on Violence Against Women and Human Trafficking at Tarleton State University. And I'm going to walk us through some of the highlights of the research evaluation of the ordinance. But first, I do want to thank former Mayor Ken Shetter for envisioning the ordinance, and Chief Cordell from Burleson Police Department, and Chief Davis of the Burleson Fire Department for implementing it, because it was a lot of work to get it up and running, and their dedication to this has really laid the ground for some of the successes that I'll be sharing with you shortly. I also need to thank the National Institute of Justice for graciously funding the research so that we could take a deep dive into the data to understand the impact of this on the community. And it's really important that we do a special shout out to our anonymous control site that allowed us to make some of the conclusions that I'm about to share with you. It is not easy being a control site, and we were so lucky that we were able to find a comparable control site so that we could share results with you with some scientific confidence. I also want to acknowledge my co-principal investigator, Dr. Catherine Brown, who kicked off the webinar, as well as Dr. Courtney Franklin from Washington State University, who served as a co-PI as well. And we had an army of graduate students that helped us with all of this. So I'm going to walk us through the evaluation overview. So we're ready for the next slide. So the evaluation progressed across 3 phases. So first we did an evaluability assessment, which was just to see, do these agencies have the data that we need to be able to do scientific research? Fortunately, they did, right? So we're here to share that today. Then we did a process evaluation, which looked at, are they doing what they said they would do? Are they implementing the ordinance with fidelity? And when we say fidelity, for those of you not familiar with research terminology, fidelity means, are they basically following the protocols? Are they doing what they were supposed to be doing? Are they compliant with the ordinance? And then we concluded our broader evaluation project with an outcome evaluation. Is this making a difference is really what that's looking at. So while the ordinance itself, it was written to address all forms of strangulation, and I think you heard some of our former panelists here talk about that, the study itself only looks at intimate partner violence related strangulation incidents. And then there was a time frame that we were focused on from 2016 to 2020. It's always nice to extend a project as long as you can, but time and resources are always an issue. And then cleaning data and getting data ready for analysis takes time. So we've got a few years before the ordinance to look at and a few years after the ordinance to look at. So in terms of our methodology, we utilized a quasi-experimental design. And so what that basically means is that we looked at Burleson versus itself over time. Burleson pre-ordinance versus Burleson post-ordinance. Did they do better over time? Then we looked at Burleson versus a comparable control site. We also use an array of mixed methods that I'll describe shortly. But before I do that, I do want to talk about our screening process for identification of intimate partner violence strangulation cases to include in the study. We went further. We didn't trust, no offense, chiefs, we didn't trust if the police said this is an impede breath case. We looked at everything to see, was this any type of strangulation noted here, regardless of how it was treated in terms of the criminal justice system. If strangulation is alleged or suspected, the ordinance says a medical response must occur. And so we really cast a wide net to identify strangulation in the study. So we began with 867 family violence incidents involving intimate partners, and then we screened further to see if strangulation was present. And what that means is that we read every incident report, every report supplement, every family violence packet, every victim, witness, suspect statement, any attachment that was available in the record management system, and the flags that Chief talked about in the RMS system as well were examined. And then we went further than that, and we looked at some of the CAD data and the CAD notes of what was happening at sort of the beginning of the incident to see, was there any thought that or any evidence that strangulation existed. So after this exhaustive process, we were left with 272 intimate partner violence related strangulation incidents, which is 32% of their family violence cases. Moving over to the control site, we started with 833 family violence incidents involving intimate partners, and we identified 135 IPVRS incidents, and that's about 16% of their cases. So to really contextualize this, in the published literature, we know strangulation prevalence ranges anywhere from 10% to 68%. And it really depends on the location of the study and the study sample. Generally, samples from victim service organizations are going to show higher prevalence than you will see in a police sample. Okay. And so we're really hovering right there in the middle of that range with the Burleson cases. Next slide, please. Okay, so as you can see from the figure on the left, our study methodology utilized qualitative and quantitative methods and data. Due to time limitations today, and I don't want to do an, paralysis through analysis to everyone here, but because of time limitations, we are going to just highlight some findings of what we learned from the police case files, what we learned from the strangulation worksheet data coming out of the fire department, and results from a first responder survey that we did testing first responders on their strangulation knowledge, their technical knowledge of strangulation. Did they get better over time? It's also noteworthy, though, that we spent a lot of time talking to all stakeholders. We did interviews. We did not just a first responder survey on strangulation knowledge. We also talked to them about how the protocol was being implemented, challenges and successes, things like that. We also collected data from One Safe Place on clients that were from Burleson and the comparable control site and their experiences. We also did a survivor survey. And then finally, we did do some analysis of body cam footage to really help understand when we saw a fidelity problem in the data, we used the body cam footage to help us understand what happened. How can we learn constructively from mistakes? Because mistakes are going to happen when you're implementing something new. So, as you can see on the figure on the right, our analytic strategy for both the process and the outcome evaluation was really multifaceted. We did all kinds of statistical techniques, bivariate, multivariate analyses. We did quantitative, qualitative analyses. We dug into the officer narratives and did content analysis of officer narratives, how they talked about strangulation, how they described strangulation. We also used pretty advanced statistical methods known as propensity score weighting to estimate the average treatment effect of the ordinance on a variety of outcomes. And so for those of you that are research statistical geeks, if you want to learn more about this, there'll be a link at the end of the webinar where you can link to the NIJ study that's been published on their website, and you can see all the statistical tables and techniques and all that fun stuff. But I do think it's worth mentioning as you sort of look at this slide, kind of think about the range of data that was collected for this study and then the range of analytical techniques that we used. That helps us really understand and contextualize these findings with more confidence because we just didn't rely on any one source. Next slide. Okay, so this figure that you're looking at demonstrates the range of outcomes the NIJ study looked at. We can only cover a few today, but we will talk about first responder knowledge, how that changed over time. We'll look at how well the PD did at identifying strangulation so they could get fire on scene. We'll look at some criminal justice outcomes, and we'll look at some victim and survivor outcomes. Next slide, please. Okay, so there's a lot going on this slide. I'm not going to say a ton about the process evaluation, but this slide is about the process evaluation. So I want to make a few remarks about what we learned about fidelity. Again, fidelity being compliance to the ordinance. We learned a lot about things that were happening well, that were going well, and things that were problematic that tend to happen early on during an implementation of a new initiative like this. So this slide is showing you fidelity, and the figure on the left and the table on the right are showing you the identical information just in different formats. And the big takeaway from the process evaluation is that fidelity to the ordinance was dependent on adherence to earlier steps in the strangulation protocol. So as you heard both chiefs talk, there's a specific time order kind of event of things that need to happen during the ordinance for it to be fully implemented as designed by the city. So if you miss a step earlier in the strangulation protocol, it's going to impact the ability of the next subsequent steps to actually happen or not, right? So it's a funnel effect, in other words. So if officers did not use their strangulation checklist, and they had their own checklist as well, you are not going to often see them calling out fire. Okay. And so that's important that they're doing something that precedes the next step. If Burleson PD doesn't call Burleson Fire, then fire can't do their part of the ordinance. They're not even on scene, right? So at first glimpse, when you sort of pull in your eye to the data on the table, you might say, wow, things don't look too good for fire. And what we want to emphasize is that fire did great. The oops kind of thing, right? The cringe factor here is in 38% of the cases that we looked at during the process evaluation, fire was not called when they were supposed to have been called. And so out of fairness to Burleson Police, that those cases tended to happen early in the ordinance. And so that is something that got self-corrected over time. But that didn't allow fire to come in and do their part of it. So when fire was called, and this figure doesn't demonstrate that, but when fire was called to scene, they were there and they did their worksheet 94% of the time. And when in the cases where they didn't, and that was very rare, that also happened early in the ordinance. So over time, we saw them getting better, okay? So this is kind of an early scorecard in terms of implementation. And you can always learn a great deal from implementation science of, okay, here's how we need to get better. You have to be self-reflective. You can't just do this and at the end do an outcome evaluation. You need to look at where things are going well and where things are going wrong. Okay, next page, please. Okay, so this slide shows survey results from our first responder strangulation survey. And first responders in Burleson and the control site were surveyed about their strangulation knowledge across a 31 item assessment. Like, we really grilled them on strangulation technical knowledge. And so we looked at this pre and post ordinance. So they did the survey before the training that they had in Burleson. And then we also looked at them after the training and looked at their improvements in their technical knowledge of strangulation. And then we did the same, and not the same, but we looked at just how the control site performed. And also MedStar said that they would participate in this, which was great. And we looked at their technical knowledge. And so as you can see from the figure on the left, Burleson first responders significantly increased their technical knowledge scores pre and post training. So the pre-training scores are going to be demonstrated in lighter shading. And the post-training scores are in darker shading. Okay. And so when you look at Burleson combined, fire and PD, that's going to be purple. And you can see that the bar moved up. That's what you want. And this was a statistically significant change. So they got better post-training as you would want, right? Then, because it's fire and police, and they always want to see who's doing better than the other, so we did disaggregate. And so we did look at, did police do better over time? Did fire do better over time on their technical knowledge scores? And we see that, as in, you can see here in blue, the police went from, the light blue to the dark blue. They moved their needle where it needed to move, and the fire did the same as shown in red. Each agency made significant improvements in their knowledge of strangulation. Moving to the right, let's compare Burleson overall to a control site that didn't have this training. And so you can see Burleson in purple also outperformed their counterparts at the control site, which is shown in turquoise. And then what's really noteworthy is that Burleson outperformed MedStar. And this is really impressive because MedStar participants, every single one of them was either an EMT or a paramedic. They had more medical training than the average police officer, right? Working at the Burleson Police Department. And not all of the fire personnel were were paramedics, right? And so the fact that Burleson combined did a better than MedStar, that has more medical training, after this strangulation training that they did as a result of the ordinance, is very impressive. We disaggregated this further, but I'm only allowed to show so many graphics here. But no matter how we slice or dice the data, fire versus fire, police versus police, police versus MedStar, Burleson first responders always did better. So that's really impressive, and hats off to both chiefs for making sure their personnel got good training. Next slide, please. So we also wanted to look at if knowledge obtained from the training. Okay, it's great that you can do better on a survey, but how is this manifesting itself in the field? Would this translate to better documentation of signs and symptoms? Because ultimately that's what the investigators need, and that's what the prosecutors are going to need. So we did a content analysis of police report narratives to see, are they doing better? Are they detecting signs and symptoms? Are they explaining that? That is really important. So our content analysis of these police narratives revealed that Burleson officers were significantly more likely to recognize, first of all, and then document more signs and symptoms of strangulation in their incident narratives. So you can kind of look at this figure here. The light blue is their sort of pre-performance. How did their narratives look beforehand? And then after is dark blue. And you can also see that in green, they outperformed the comparable control site. What's noteworthy is that over 28 distinct signs and symptoms were documented in police report narratives. So that doesn't mean that in one narrative, 28 signs or symptoms were documented, but across all the narratives we looked at, officers were identifying the obvious and the less obvious signs and symptoms. And so that's pretty inclusive that they were doing that we were able to identify that, yeah, they were doing this. They also were more likely to be more detailed over time in the pre and post analyses that we did. Next slide, please. So I mentioned earlier that we did do interviews with first responders and to get an understanding from them of what it was like to implement the ordinance and their experiences with it, their buy-in. And I can't go into all of that, but I do think this quote is really telling. And I will read it just because I know some people may be calling into the webinar, but this really helps demonstrate the importance of recognizing and documenting those signs and symptoms and understanding how to do that. So this is a police department participant talking to us as researchers. That's what the officer needs. They need the signs and symptoms so that they can have enough awareness to know when to call for somebody to come check them, i.e. the victim, out, giving them, i.e. the police, straightforward training on the lethality of it and ringing those bells that they've already seen in their career. That's when you know, because the light comes on, you're like, wow, I've seen that a bunch of times, but didn't understand what I was looking at. And so this is someone kind of realizing how many times in their career prior to this specialized training, prior to the ordinance, that they may have missed really telling signs and symptoms. And the realization and the importance of that resonated with them. And they shared this very passionately with us in our interview. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to cover a lot of ground here, and I promised you not a lot of statistical numbers and stuff like that, but if you want those goodies, we'll show you how to get to them. But I am covering a lot of ground. In the interest of time, I'm going to use some arrows just to quickly convey some key findings so that we can open this up to questions, because I know many of you may have some questions for our participants here. So the first thing we wanted to look at is, did they get better at identifying strangulation and calling something that's really, you can read a narrative and see that this is strangulation. Why aren't they calling it strangulation? Why aren't they investigating it as an impede breath case? So we wanted to look at, did they get better at identifying it and calling it what it is, okay? And so we did find that pre and post ordinance, that identification of strangulation improved significantly. And it also was significantly higher in Burleson relative to the control site. So they outperformed themselves over time, which is what you want, and they outperformed the control site, which is what you want if you're implementing something like this. We also looked at the crux of the ordinance, which is the medical response. And so that increased significantly pre and post ordinance. And it also increased significantly versus the control site. Many more medical responses in the control site, to the point, I will just share this briefly, it's an anonymous control site, to the point that the point of contact that I was working with at the control site fire department was really upset when he realized how many times they had never been called to come assess a patient that had been a strangulation victim when I showed them their data. He was just completely, I mean, it was important that they received that information, but he definitely was really upset about it. And so this was important to work with your fire partners and to get them on scene so they can do their job. They do great work. So that changed over time in Burleson. They also not only just got fire on scene, they also moved the needle on medical assessment. So that increased significantly pre and post ordinance. It also was much better than what we saw in the control site. Okay, so these next few items, they're not necessarily things that were articulated and mandated in the ordinance itself. These are things that the grant wanted to look at to say, hey, are there other outcomes that an ordinance like this might produce, right? So there's like some desired outcomes that Chief had that we wanted to look at and that we needed to look at, for the grant. And so one thing we looked at was emergency protective orders over time. And we didn't see a huge difference on those in Burleson pre and post ordinance. They were already doing a pretty good job of that going into all of this. But when we compared them to the control site, we learned that Burleson requested more and received more EPOs than the control site. And one reason maybe for that, I mean, we didn't go talk to magistrates about their decision making, so I can't speak to that. But one reason I suspect is because they were documenting very well in their EPO paperwork the strangulation event. And I think that may have helped as well. We looked at arrests. And so we saw that those increased significantly in Burleson pre and post ordinance, and they also outperformed the control site. We looked at a series of items on victim engagement, and what we learned there, it's a little complex. I think many of you here working with survivors understand the complexity of this. And so we learned that the ordinance really overall had negligible impact on victim engagement, survivor engagement, but there were two exceptions that I do want to note. What we saw was in terms of criminal justice system activation, calling the police for help, and then being willing to provide a written statement about what happened. We did see that occur more often in Burleson relative to the control site. Okay, next slide, please. I think it's really fitting to end our evaluation overview here with a quote from a strangulation survivor. I think hearing from them is really important. And so this is a survivor that participated in our survivor survey. And I'll read again for those of you that may have called in. I do want to show appreciation that ultimately it was handled and he was arrested because that saved my life. I just needed it a lot sooner. I made it out alive, but many women do not. Next slide. So as Chief noted, and I just want to say again, we need to gratefully acknowledge the Training Institute on Strangulation Prevention and their affiliate leaders for the material that we did use from them today in the webinar. But for those of you not familiar with them, there is a link to their website where you too can obtain these materials. Next slide, please. So I promised you we would produce information where you can get checklists, where you can get information if you want to do something like this. I also noted that the NIJ research reports are available on the National Institute of Justice website. But I also want to note that there's a training slide deck available on that website. And so there's training materials you can get from the entities listed here, but there's also a training slide deck on, okay, how do we kind of spell out why is this important? And then how do you implement an ordinance? If you were to copy Burleson's ordinance, you would already have a training slide deck that you could utilize and download and just put that in and not have to reinvent the wheel. You might have to tweak it a little bit for your own reasons, but it's there. And Dr. Brown took leadership on that and did an outstanding job. And so I really applaud her for that. And she worked collaboratively with the two agencies to utilize content that they used in their training to produce that. And so then the next slide. We will be transitioning to an audience poll, and Lacey will be bringing that up. But we do want to know from you, what is the first action that you plan to take after this webinar? And so we'll give you a moment, and then Lacey will report out on the findings.
Well, I've seen a lot of wonderful feedback in the chat, and with about 50% responding and still going, but at least almost 70% are going to share information with their team. 28% say they're going to research further on the topic, and there are a handful that are going to implement a new strategy. So we'll leave that open for another couple of minutes. We do have some questions. You are ready to transition to questions. Okay, our first question, and Chief, you may be the best person, Chief Cordell may be the best person to answer this. But someone asked, is an ordinance the same as mandatory reporting by police if strangulation is involved in intimate partner violence?
Well, the ordinance, it's kind of a unique deal in that I went to council and basically passed an ordinance against myself. What it is, it doesn't have teeth in it, like we're not prosecuting anybody for an offense. We use the state charges on that. What it solely does is just recognize and acknowledges the fact that the lethality of strangulation and the lack of training on the part of most first responders. And then it requires the medical response. So we're calling out the medical professionals, which it makes perfect sense because we are not the medical professionals. We need them on there. They educate the surviving victims of these crimes. And so it's not the same in the regard of what the question was. This is more about just making sure that we memorialize a response to these type calls when strangulation is an element of it.
Thank you. Next question. How often are you seeing children being strangled by men such as fathers, stepfathers, or mothers' boyfriends? If you have data, what is unique for children? And I believe there was another question about if you're dealing with a strangulation with a child, how do you handle if the parent or parents aren't willing to be cooperative? So if you want to address children, whoever wants.
And I don't have the exact numbers on that. I don't know if Dr. Brown or Dr. Shelley recalled any of those cases when they were doing the research.
It was pretty rare where we saw it documented that children were strangled within the intimate partner violence related incident, but it doesn't mean that it didn't occur.
Yeah.
It just may mean that the right questions.
Yeah. And we would handle it the same way that we'd handle any other offense. And, intimate partner living in the same household, and we'd enforce the laws as you would expect on that. What we saw more probably, and we actually have an ordinance on a child witness side of this, is that, and I think the stats from the Training Institute address that, is how many children actually witness the violence within the home. And I'm looking through my notes here because I believe I have that. 43% of children have witnessed their mother be strangled. When you go back and you look at child witness and the ordinance and then the research on that, if I recall the numbers correctly, a child that witnesses violence is 1,500 times more likely to be involved in violence down the road. So we also addressed that with our officers and had training on that to acknowledge the child. And there's some research out there that says that how the police officer acknowledges the child, and that's with the parents' consent, goes a long ways toward, the recovery of that child. So two separate issues. We probably see more of the witness side of that than we do the actual strangulation of a child.
Great, thank you. Okay, someone asked, have you seen an increase in successful prosecution for offenders who commit felony strangulation in your area? Most times the charges are reduced, dropped, or the offender's given a proverbial slap on the wrist.
It's, and the research on this did not cover the prosecution side of this, but what we've seen, and we've got two different, I'm not going to throw either one under the bus by any means, but two different prosecuting offices, one in Tarrant County, one in Johnson County. Tarrant County has an intimate partner violence unit that will take cases forward, even though you have a non-cooperating victim or witness. The other county will have a tendency to drop cases if they come in. We, as a police organization, have a no drop policy, so we will file those cases and in hopes of the prosecution. But just like so many other things, our victims' assistants, when I've talked to them and said, when you speak to our surviving victims, what what are the excuses of why they want to drop a case? And it's not anything that this group doesn't know, the financial side of this, the kids are involved in it, and all of the things that we've heard over and over again. But, you try to point out too, that if the child witnessed this, then, you're trying to break a cycle here. And if they're 1,500 times more likely to commit violence, down the road, there's a lot that you need to take in. But, that's a choice from the police side of it. We're always going to encourage prosecution, but, there's a myriad of reasons why they want to drop charges.
And if I can just jump in from the research side, it was not something that was examined as part of the research grant. However, as we were examining these files, we could sometimes see the outcome, and there would be paperwork in the RMS system showing what was happening on the prosecutorial side. And I don't know who the question came from, but you're right. We could definitely see trends where the police, the fire are providing what looks like a very solid case, and it moves up the chain, and then they're reducing charges or not pursuing any further action. And as a researcher, it was outrageous to see that. I got really frustrated. I know Dr. Brown got frustrated seeing that. But part of the recommendations that we make in our research report is we have to go beyond this. Like, this was a starting point. The ordinance is doing what it needs to be doing. And so now we need to continue to educate and reach out, and everyone needs to be part of this, to pull in our prosecutors, partner with them, pull in judges. Like, we just all need to partner together to get a more well-rounded, coordinated response. Like, right now, we've got a great coordinated response in Burleson, right? But we've got to pull in the prosecutors and the judges and others in the community to continue to improve systematic responses that really serve our survivors.
Yeah, and I'll add to that a little bit more. Contacting the medical professionals, getting our fire department out there, that's aimed, and the primary target of that is to be able to educate the victims, get them the medical help that they need. But a byproduct of that is they also become a witness to what is going on, and that information is documented in the report and submitted to the district attorneys. And I'll add one quick story that occurred here. I was walking through the lobby after hours one night, and a lady walked in, and she said she wanted to speak with the detective. And of course, the detective had already gone home. So I asked her, I said, "Is there something I can help you with? Is there something, a question I may be able to answer?" And she said, "Well, I'm just here to drop charges on a case." And I said, "What kind of case is it?" And she said it was a family violence, and her partner was arrested. And I said, "So tell me why you want to drop the charges." And it was the usual things that we hear over and over again, and I asked her, I said, "Let me just ask you a question. If you don't want to answer, you don't have to, but have you been strangled? Were you strangled during this?" And she goes, "Oh yeah, I've strangled here. I've been strangled many, many times before." So it gave me an opportunity to educate her on the lethality of strangulation and why we do what we do, and re-emphasize to her. I didn't follow up to see if she actually went down and dropped charges. She was pretty adamant about it. My suspicion was that she did. But, it gives you an opportunity to go in and re-educate them. And I know we try to hit that on three angles. We've got, the on the scene between police and fire. Then we have the detective that speaks with them again. And then we have a victim assistance coordinator that, again, re-emphasizes this, so that we can really drive this point home on the lethality of strangulation and the importance of getting medical help.
I really think the ordinance, just as our community's commitment to take this serious and be committed to having a good response to it.
Absolutely.
Thank you. One question here, and I think this was submitted during your slides, Chief Cordell, when you were talking about seeing the increase in your cases, and they asked if you believe the increase of cases was due to better identification.
Oh, no question. When we went through the training on this, and again, you had a tremendous baseline to be able to build this. This is, I want to emphasize, this was not a heavy lift on us to do all of these things. We had checklists. ICCR and the Training Institute on Strangulation Prevention has an incredible amount of data and a toolkit in each of those that can guide you quickly. We will share our information. You can see our BPD info at burlesontx.com on the screen. We'll share any and everything that we have. So yeah, I think when we educated our officers and we started training them, again, when you go through the academy, we didn't train on things like this. So this was something over and beyond. And once we started educating our officers and they started asking the right questions, started going through the checklist, I think it started being driven home, because you looked at what Dr. Shelley said, and that was that some of the failures were early on in this, and then later on it was we got better at doing it. And I think it's a transition of something that we haven't done before. It's a transition for our fire partners over there to be coming out and asking medical questions that are pertinent to a criminal investigation. But I think we got better as we went forward with that, because our officers got more comfortable with it, and our officers got a lot better education throughout the process.
I think it's like anything. Once you start measuring it, you start getting better at it. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. Someone asked, what happens if the abuser flees the scene of the crime? Will there be a warrant? Does the victim receive public services thereafter?
Yes to all the above. The elements of the offense, if they fled the scene, and that happens quite a bit. You should know in intimate partner violence, you're going to know who your offender is and have the information on them. So processing a warrant is something we would absolutely do, and then continue to pursue after them. The victim has access to our victims assistance coordinator. We have one full-time position, and then we have a 20-hour-a-week position. And a lot of that is aimed at working closely with Tarleton State when we were going through this process, to be able to share that information on what we were seeing from their perspective and how cooperative the witness was, whether they left or whether they stayed. They would often share things with the victims assistance coordinator on that. And again, that's where we got many of the rationale in the survivors' minds as to why they needed to stay. I'm not financially stable, or I've got kids involved, and this happened one time. Whatever rationalization that they used, they shared with our victims assistance. But we offer those services for all of our victims, and to ensure that we're connecting them with the resources they need. Again, this is about helping them with their recovery or mental health, and doing everything we can to educate them.
Great. One more question, I think. What would you say is the best way to reach out to local PD, fire, EMS, et cetera, to share this information? How would you approach it in a way it would be received well?
Are you talking about us reaching out to other entities? Or are you talking about them contacting us for information?
I think in their own community.
Maybe an advocate contacting police.
Yeah, I mean, again, we've got our emails up there so that you can contact us with anything or questions that you might have. We have pushed and educated around the Metroplex in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Now that the research is completed, I think that puts us in a position where Mayor Shetter and I have talked about now going back and re-educating those around us. I know there are some agencies that have adopted not necessarily the same path, but a similar path. And again, that's what we want to do is through the education, is be able to push this out, get it statewide, nationwide would be awesome. Because again, it's not a heavy lift for an agency. You're not putting a lot back on them. You heard Chief Davis talk about the number of calls that we answered and that they're going to, and it didn't really add a lot of burden on anybody. Because the goal is to protect victims, and all of us are here in this business to do that.
I would just like to add on to that. If anybody wants to be an advocate for that, and they go to their local police department or fire department and they need us for some kind of backup or assistance to help speak to our experience, I would be happy to talk to anyone. So
absolutely.
And if I can just jump in quickly, we surveyed all the first responders in the community here about their impressions of the ordinance and it demonstrated need for it, things like that. And they were overwhelmingly supportive. I've never seen such high response and positive response. And moving from just sort of a data point to conversations with the frontline personnel at both agencies, what got them committed to this was once they became aware of the dangers, the lethality, how so many signs and symptoms are missed and that people do need to be medically screened. It was a no-brainer for them. They all emphatically said, this is just, you got to do it. And so I think if it's done in a way that's done in partnership, but education is the place to start. And then I think the rest will kind of happen, hopefully, in a natural way. I mean, I don't know if either chief has any more to add to that, but that's kind of what we saw on the research side.
I also think we have to point out that it does give more documentation of evidence. And I don't know any detective that would want less evidence, or any prosecutor that would want less evidence for a prosecutorial aid. So I also think that's one thing to be able to point out to local agencies.
Thank you. Okay, let's see. One last question, unless we have about 15 more minutes, if anybody else has a question they would like to submit. But someone asked, is it common for victims of strangulation to inflict injuries on themselves?
We didn't really look at that, but we did read the narratives. I would say that's incredibly rare.
Yeah.
Dr. Shelley can weigh in on the narratives that she saw, but I don't know that I had anything that was documented that way.
I don't recall
Okay.
anything that indicated that myself. So I did not read the narratives like Dr. Brown and Dr. Shelley did, but I haven't seen much of my career over that.
I can't recall
Right, unless
a single
just
one.
defensive injuries would be probably the only thing you might be able to speak to.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, that was documented. We did see where there would be documentation of injuries to the suspect, and because of more awareness on the PD side, it was most of the time understood as this is not the victim attacking the suspect, this is the victim defending themselves during an act of a strangulation. So they got better at describing those situations as well, if I'm following the question.
We know, and just as an extra point, we know that strangulation is an indication that we're escalating our behaviors, and that eventually you're going to become the victim of a homicide. I saw that in my previous employment, retiring from Fort Worth Police and over homicide, but I also saw that in at least 2 cases here that I can think of off the top of my head, where strangulation was the main element and the cause of death for 2 different females within Burleson over the last few years.
Okay, one more question that came, or a couple more. Let's see, someone said, can you speak to the prevalence of strangulation in the context of sexual violence in IPV relationships in your study?
One of the homicides,
Okay.
one of the homicides that I talked about was during a sexual escapade between a male and a female, and he was strangling her and went too far. I don't know that he meant to kill her, but he did. But I mean, that's one of our homicides that I was speaking to.
And so Dr. Brown can jump into, so we looked specifically at, IPV related strangulation. And so in our screening process, we began with family violence cases. So it's possible that there were some sexual assaults in Burleson where strangulation occurred that didn't make its way into our data. However, it still would have been responded to by the city of Burleson and invoked the strangulation protocol. If strangulation is alleged, no matter what type of crime it's alleged during, it's going to result in the protocol being triggered. But among the cases that we looked at, I would say, and Dr. Brown, you can correct me if you want, because I don't have it right in front of me, I would say about 3% of the cases that we looked at happened during the course or as in addition to a sexual assault.
I would say that sounds about right for the prevalence. It was pretty low.
All right, well, that's all of the questions that we have right now. Would you mind advancing the slides? Thank you. Thank y'all so much. There's been so much good talk in the chat. and the Q&As. Thank you all so much for all of your hard work on this. I know this has been a labor of love for many years for all of you, but thanks for sharing your expertise, and hopefully we can ignite change in some of the other communities that will consider or begin the process of adopting an ordinance similar to this. So with that, we'd love to let you guys know about our conference coming up, our 20th anniversary. Cannot believe it's been 20 years. And so May 19th through the 22nd, registration is now open for the Conference on Crimes Against Women. We also have some scholarships available if you want to check out our website for information about scholarships. And then if you'll advance one more time for me, Kathy.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. It's okay. All it was is just a thank you and my contact information. I believe, who knows? I might not have even put that in there. But anyway, I am going to put my email in the chat. You will receive a survey at the end of today's presentation. If you will complete that survey, you will get a certificate for your attendance today. Also, by hopefully Monday, we will have the recording of today's presentation along with the handouts and the links and the documents that were shared in the chat today on our website. So please don't hesitate to reach out. I know that all of our participants here today would be more than happy to answer any questions that you may have or help you in any way they can. So thank you all again for being here, and have a great evening. Thanks.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.